Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Medieval the Black Labyrinth. This is the recently released, I say recently, it released back in August, DLC for Medieval, which is a first-person shooter that came out back in 2019, and when I reviewed it, it turned out to be an absolutely fantastic game that I very highly recommend to fans of old-school first-person shooters, or really just first-person shooters in general. Now, if you're not familiar with Medieval, I will go ahead and throw a link in the video description box, as well as on a card that's going to pop up on the screen here, that will take you to my original Medieval review, so you can take a look at that and get up to speed before you start looking into the Black Labyrinth DLC. Because this is, after all, a DLC. It's not a standalone expansion, it's not a sequel. It requires the base game to function. So the logical assumption would be that if you're watching this video, you're already familiar with Medieval, and you want to know if the DLC itself is worth picking up. Well, let's just go ahead and go over exactly what you get in the DLC. Well, it certainly doesn't give you much in terms of storyline, although admittedly neither did the base game. But where in the original game, the protagonist is already the champion who is seeking to defeat evil once and for all, in the Black Labyrinth DLC, he is simply known as the Wanderer, and he's trying to become the champion by completing the challenge of the Black Labyrinth and having the title bestowed upon him. And that's it. That's the entire storyline. There's nothing to it at all, really. It's basically just an explanation of how the champion got the axe that he uses during the main campaign and got the title of champion. So if you were expecting some massive lore expansion or anything like that, you're going to be sorely disappointed, but let's face it, Medieval is an almost exclusively gameplay-focused title that doesn't really concern itself much with storyline, so that's what you focus on in the Black Labyrinth DLC as well. Well, you get a 9-level campaign, plus 1 secret level for a total of 10 levels, with each of the levels being about twice as long as one of the levels in the base game. So despite there only being 10 levels in total, with one of them being a really short secret level, it actually ends up being a pretty good-sized campaign that's going to take most players around 4 to 6 hours to finish. Obviously, the actual length is going to depend on how many secrets you go for, because there are a lot of secrets in this game, of course, which is in keeping with the style from the base game, as well as which difficulty setting you're playing on and how quickly you tend to get through games in general. As for the levels themselves, well, in addition to being about twice the size of a level in the base game, they're also more complicated than the levels in the base game. There's a lot more emphasis on dealing with various environmental hazards and traps, as well as solving puzzles, than what you saw in the base game, and it's actually quite well done for the most part. Now sure, a lot of the puzzles are very simplistic, and you'll be able to figure them out almost instantly, but to be fair, this is an action-packed first-person shooter, and not a puzzle game, so you don't really expect too much in the realm of puzzles. Similarly, since you don't really have much in the way of advanced movement, don't expect too much in terms of traps either. They're usually fairly easy to avoid as long as you're paying attention to your environment. What you do need to pay a bit more attention to, however, are the new enemy types, which you get throughout the entirety of the Black Labyrinth campaign as opposed to what you got in the base game, where from episode to episode the enemies would change, but you would have a few types that were consistent throughout. Despite a lessened variety in enemies, however, they're used in better ways because the level design overall is definitely better than the base game. Now sure, it's not massively better, but the developers were clearly much more comfortable with the level design tools and the actual design of levels in general, so not only do they flow really well, but they're able to put in some really cool set pieces here and there, as well as provide some areas that are just beautiful to look at, much like in the base game of course, but just with more polish overall. The only real caveat here is that it's a DLC, which means that they designed this primarily for people who'd already played through the base game, which means that the difficulty level is more along the lines of the midpoint of the Medieval campaign, moving on up towards the end of it. Obviously not a problem if you've already played through the base game and know what to expect, but if you're just jumping into a Medieval and you think, oh, well, I'll go with the chronological prequel first, it's not really the best idea. It's certainly not unmanageable, but you're just better off playing through the base game first. Especially considering that there are 2 different weapons in the Black Labyrinth DLC compared to the base game that if you're like me, you might actually end up preferring to what was in the base game. The first of these should be pretty obvious. Since you don't have the Axe of the Black Labyrinth yet, what do you have as your melee weapon? Well, you have a pair of gauntlets, and whenever you switch to them, you punch them together before you can start pummeling enemies into the dirt. And while fans of Hexen 2 will obviously go, I see what you did there, you will find that punching things in Hexen 2 is really not very fun at all, whereas in AMID Evil, it's ridiculously satisfying. You really feel like you're doing some damage with those fists, and when you activate soul power with them, it just becomes downright ridiculous. You go full Kenshiro on them. And look, as fun as the Axe of the Black Labyrinth is, the punch almost makes it feel underpowered, which is just silly. There's a similar effect with the new weapon that replaces the Ethereum, which was effectively AMID Evil's equivalent of a BFG, where it shot out an orb that just annihilated things. In the Black Labyrinth DLC, on the other hand, you get the Void Splitter, which is a scythe that launches out a massive wave of energy that just slices through pretty much anything in its path, unless it's a particularly powerful enemy like a boss. And when you activate soul power on it, well, let's just say you learn very quickly how it got its name. Like I said, I find them both far more satisfying than the weapons they replace from the base game, although that's not to say that the base game's weapons aren't satisfying. They are ridiculously satisfying as well, it's just that the new weapons are just really fun to use. And that does ultimately lead me to the conclusion I have for AMID Evil the Black Labyrinth. It's certainly not a massive overhaul, it doesn't give you a massive amount of new things to mess around with, but what it does do is provide more AMID Evil for you to mess around with. Everything that made the base game so fantastic is still present in the Black Labyrinth, and between the more polished level design and the couple of new weapons for you to mess around with, it's just different enough to still feel pretty fresh. As such, I can easily recommend it to anybody who already liked AMID Evil. You're going to enjoy the Black Labyrinth if you already enjoyed AMID Evil. But for those of you who haven't really gotten into AMID Evil yet, or were looking to pick up AMID Evil and were curious about whether the Black Labyrinth is worth picking up, well, you need to ask yourself a simple question. Do you see yourself playing through the entire game along with its DLC? If so, go ahead and pick up the base game with its DLC. Otherwise, go ahead and pick up the base game, and if you happen to enjoy that, go ahead and pick up the Black Labyrinth afterwards, because it'll be more of a game you already found yourself enjoying. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.